Hello, my name is Jim Lee. I'm a Shawnee tribal member and a board member of the Shawnee Indian Mission Foundation. I wanted to talk today about the difference between the Shawnee Indian Mission School, the manual labor school, versus the government forced boarding schools that everybody's heard so much about in the last few years. And to explain the difference between the two, they were not the same, and I'll tell you why. There's been a lot of disinformation passed about in the last couple of years, and that's all it is disinformation. So I want to explain that to everybody. So, what is disinformation? The definition of disinformation is false information deliberately and often covertly spread as by the planning of rumors in order to influence public opinion or obscure the truth. We've all seen that and heard all the rhetoric about the Shawnee Mission in the last couple of years. They've tried to paint the picture that it was an evil place and that it was the same as the boarding schools from the late 1800s that have become so infamous in the last few years. But disinformation, we've all heard that on the media in the last few years as well. It seems like lying to everyone is normal now and it's acceptable. It's hard to believe, but that seems to be the norm. So in the past couple of years, there's been a large amount of disinformation that's been put out about the Shawnee Indian Manual Labor School or the Mission School. The disinformation has portrayed the school as being equivalent to the government forced boarding schools that existed beginning about in the 1870s. And there's a stark difference between the two schools, the time periods and the activities of the Shawnee in the 1800s versus the Plains Indians, who were basically the reason for the forced boarding schools that happened later in the 1870s. In order to understand the difference between the Shawnee Mission here in Kansas and the later mission schools, we kind of need to look at the history of the Shawnee before they came to Kansas. They were an eastern Algonquin tribe that were in New York, Pennsylvania, Ohio. Some were down south in the Florida area as well. But their main home was the Ohio area, and they were intermixed with the Delaware and the Iroquois and some of the other tribes I'm sure you've heard of. And so uh, they basically interacted with the Europeans who came over trying to get away from the European kings who were, um, caused a lot of trouble in Europe. And of course, that's why everybody ended up coming over to the United States. It, in this time, there was some fighting going on, but not as much as would come later. The Shawnee and the Delaware developed a friendship with William Penn in Pennsylvania, and William Penn decided to buy land from the Delaware on the Delaware River. And his opinion was that the natives owned the land. Of course, that was a European concept, but that they owned the land, and he wanted to purchase the land from them and have it deeded. And so the Delaware in 1682 sold him land. The Shawnee were also present at that point, and that was kind of the first time that they had sold land to anyone, any of the Europeans. But over time, more and more people came to the New World and caused problems and started pushing the Shawnee and the other tribes westward. And so at that point, then the wars really started. And from 1650 to about 1812, the Shawnee were continuously fighting to keep their homelands. So after about 150 years of fighting the Europeans and then later the Americans, the Shawnee were basically through fighting. 1795, they'd had enough, and they realized that they were just not going to be able to defeat the ever encroaching Americans into Ohio. So they ceded Ohio to the United States. Shawnee Chiefs Blue Jacket and Black Hoof were the primary leaders at the time, and they realized it just wasn't worth the effort. They had killed so many of our men and women, and burned down their villages time and time again for 150 years, and they were done. So these two leaders at the time, in and around 1800, they started farming, and they decided that that's what they needed to do, to quit fighting, start farming, and start living that way. And about that time, Tecumseh and his brother, the prophet, had come into being prominent, and Tecumseh hated the Americans to no end. They'd killed his father at the Battle of Point Pleasant, and he uh, just hated the Americans completely. And so he, along with his brother, the prophet, gathered some other tribes and some other younger Shawnees, and they continued to fight against the Americans. And they fought with the British the War of 1812 against the Americans. And at the Battle of Thames, Tecumseh was killed, and that basically ended all the Shawnee efforts to fight the Americans, and that was essentially the end of it. And that was uh, um, the main group of Shawnee was Blue Jacket, Black Hoof. They stopped about 1800, and Tecumseh still around 1812. So just kind of remember those dates. So several years after the War of 1812, the United States government wrote a treaty called the Treaty of Fort Meigs, which was in 1817, and the treaty relinquished the rest of the land that the Shawnee had in part of Ohio and Indiana and Michigan. All of the tribes had moved further west, and so that was now what they would term Indian Territory. And at that point, the government established several small reservations for each of the tribes who lived in the areas. This was the first time that they'd actually decided to put the tribes, they've narrowed their land, the scope of the land so much that now they were living on reservations. And this was going to be repeated later. But again, this is 1817, so this was the first time. And you'll know from history, remember from history, that in the after the Civil War, most of the tribes were in the West were put on reservations. But so anyway, the Shawnee were forced onto three small reservations in northwest Ohio. So not too many years after the Treaty of Fort Meigs, the Shawnee were again uprooted and forced to move, this time to Kaw land in what would later become the state of Kansas. The Shawnee had moved to some of the Shawnee had moved to Spanish territory near St. Louis, Cape Girardeau area after the 1795 war, and they had made a deal with the Spanish government to come and fight the Osage. The Osage were encroaching on what was Spanish territory and causing them problems. So they had some of the Shawnee. The Shawnee were tired of fighting the Americans, so they moved west of the Mississippi trying to get away, and they had better relations with the Spanish, and so they moved there, a good number of them. And so at that time, everything was kind of working okay, but then the War of 1812 happened, and the Louisiana Purchase happened, and the Shawnee who were in the Cape Girardeau area were now in the way of white settlement. It's always they're in the way of white settlement. And so in 1825, these Shawnee and later the Ohio Shawnee were all removed to Kansas, and they were all given 1.6 million acres of Kansas land, which was from the Missouri border far west to Geary County, wherever that's at, and they were they displaced the Kaw essentially, so they were displaced, and um, and then they settled primarily in Johnson County and over towards Topeka. So prior to the Shawnees moved to Kansas, they had begun farming, as I said earlier, as early as 1800. They were no longer fighting, except for Tecumseh and his group. There were several men that wrote journals that went through Ohio and saw Blue Jacket and Black Hoof, and they said that they had assimilated into white society and that they were farmers and lived very, very well. And they lived much like the white neighbors who had moved in since then, since the wars. Most of the rest of the Shawnee had taken up farming and ranching, and they became actually the envy of the people that lived in Ohio, the people that had moved into Ohio. They wanted, of course, the Shawnees land there, and so the Indian Removal Act ended up moving them to Kansas, like I mentioned, and it was a difficult trip. It was similar to the Cherokee Trail of Tears. They were supposed to start in the spring, so by the time they got to Kansas, they would be able to plant crops and build homes and things. And that didn't happen. The government kept dragging their feet, and they didn't end up leaving until late in the fall. And when they got to Kansas, it was winter, and so they had no food, and it was very difficult on them at that point. The Missouri Shawnee ended up moving to Kansas about 1827, 1828, and then the Ohio Shawnee moved in later, closer to 1830. During that time, there were several missions established in Kansas. What what happened was Chief Pascal Fish asked the Methodist Church to send missionaries to Kansas, and so Thomas Johnson was sent to Turner, Kansas, near the Shotos Trading Post and the Moses Grinter house. There was Moses Grinter had a ferry there, and then other tribal leaders had requested aid of two of the other churches to establish missions in the same area. The the Shawnee had dealt with the Quakers and the Baptists and the Methodists back in Ohio, and they were fond of them. They'd helped them a lot, especially the Quakers. And when they moved to Kansas, they needed some sort of help, and they asked the missions to help them establish their new homes and provide schooling for the children. There were three missions established in the Kansas City area: the Quaker Mission, which was established about 1834, the Methodist Mission, which is the one we're talking about today primarily, that Reverend Thomas Johnson actually built near Turner, and then he built a second mission, which was the current mission buildings and labor school. And then the Baptist built the Shawnee Baptist Mission, which I believe was a couple of miles northwest of the Methodist Mission. Henry Harvey was a missionary who had been with the Shawnee in Ohio, and he came to Kansas to help them establish the mission there. He was a very good friend of the Shawnee. He was an interpreter, and he transcribed a lot of the goings on between the tribe and the United States government. And so he's written some excellent records of the Shawnee from a book that he wrote. It was from 1650 through about 1860, I believe. A really good resource. And then Reverend Thomas Johnson also wrote the Annals of the Shawnee Indian Mission, which is another very good resource. And on the Shawnee Baptist Mission, Jonathan Meeker was a printer, and he was also a missionary. And he printed the first newspaper in Kansas, and it was also the first newspaper ever written entirely in a native language. He, with the help of an interpreter, was able to come up with phonetically the Shawnee language in print. And there's only one one copy still left in the world, and it's at one of the universities in Missouri. In Kansas, there were several Shawnee chiefs who were chiefs during their stay there. These are three of the more prominent ones. The one on the left is Charles Bluejacket. He was a reverend. Also, he was involved with the Shawnee Indian Mission. Graham Rogers is the chief that's in the middle. He helped build the mission. He was a student at the Turner Mission, and he became an instructor for building trades at the Shawnee Indian Mission. And then Chief Joseph Parks was another prominent chief who, that name should be familiar to most people. And he was also an interpreter, and he led several of the Shawnee in battle against the Seminole in the 1830s when the United States was fighting the Seminoles in Florida. All of the three of these had children who attended the mission. So some of the talk about the mission being an evil place, all of these men had children there, and Charles Bluejacket had children there until the mission school closed. And so they were also on the board. They helped keep the mission running, and to say that they didn't know what was going on and it was an evil place is just ridiculous. So I want to talk a little bit about the way the Shawnee lived in Kansas. As I stated earlier, they were farmers from 1800 on in Ohio, and by the time they left Ohio, they had been farming for long enough that the white people that were moving into Ohio wanted their land and their farms. And so when they were moved to Kansas, they just reestablished that with the help of the mission to become farmers and ranchers again. And so that's what they did. They lived in very nice homes. This is Charles Bluejacket's home, which is one of the nicest at that time. They didn't live in teepees. Now, most were farmers except for the Black Bob band, which Black Bob was totally against assimilating into the white culture. He wanted to live the old ways, and he and his group, with small group, they retained their old ways. They did live in small houses and teepees, and they were not happy with those from Ohio and Missouri who had decided to change to white man's ways. The Shawnee farms were said to be the envy of the white colonizers who were pushing the government to remove the Shawnee and allow for statehood in Kansas. That didn't take long. This is a drawing of Charles Bluejacket's home that's similar to that one that we'd seen on the previous page. And it was done by someone, and it's in a book from about the town of Miriam. He lived near Miriam. And you could see it's a typical home of anybody that might have lived that in that time period. This is another example of one of the homes that the Shawnee lived in while they lived in Kansas. This was built by Graham Rogers, who was a woodworker, and he learned some of his skills at the original Methodist Mission in Turner. Thomas Johnson relocated the mission to Fairway due to the influx of more Shawnee from Ohio, and they wanted to be closer to Westport. Westport was a big hub of activity in Missouri, so they could get equipment and implements and things from Missouri easily. So that's one of the reasons they moved it closer to Missouri. Graham Rogers helped build the current mission buildings as well as this home, which was probably built in the 1830s, and it still stands today on McKay Street. This home was John Silverheel's home, located at 47th and Knox, which is on Johnson County line, Johnson-Wyandotte County line. This home's still there. Again, it was built in the 1830s, and there are people still living in it, and it's a very nice house. The siding covers up the actual log structure that was there from the original 1830s. And my John Silverheels was my great grandmother's cousin. She was orphaned when she was young, and she was raised by her uncle Moses Silverheels, who was one of the leaders of the tribes and one of the wealthiest of the Shawnee. Moses and his son John both had large acreages right there on the Johnson County line. If we look at the Shawnee Indian Mission School, it was actually a trade school. It was much like what we would call a vo-tech today. The original school in Turner, Thomas Johnson was trying to Christianize the children, and he was also teaching them reading, writing, arithmetic. And they quickly realized that was not a skill that they really needed. There was no one at home to talk to in English. They had nothing to write, and there was no reason to do math. So over time, Reverend Johnson decided that maybe building a manual labor school made more sense, and they would teach the children life skills, trade skills that would allow them to improve their community. So if they needed woodworkers or they needed livestock, people to handle livestock and farm, they would teach these young boys and girls those trades rather than teaching them English and math and so on. But they did that as well. So they did teach both, but the primary function was to teach skills. The new school, which was built in 1839, became a boarding school. The original school was not a boarding school. And the reason for that was the Shawnee and the other tribes, they lived scattered out in that 1.6 million acres of Shawnee land. And so they were not down the street from the school. They had to travel sometimes an hour or two to get to the school each day. So Reverend Johnson realized that was not going to be a good thing. So they decided to allow the boarding to become a boarding school. And so this allowed the children to stay there throughout the school year, which was not the entire year. They didn't stay there during the summer, and they were able to concentrate their skills and their training over a shorter period of time. So they were usually there about 2 years, and they learned their skills, and they moved on and went back home. And so also there were a number of Shawnee residents that lived in that area that worked the farm. There was a 2,000-acre farm that was operated year round, and so it was done a lot by some of the Shawnee men that lived in the area. During the time the school was open, Reverend Johnson provided quarterly and annual reports to the Methodist Mission headquarters in Missouri. They were the ones basically funding the school. The reports listed in a book called The Annals of Shawnee Methodist Mission, an Indian labor school published by the Kansas State Historical Society. Very interesting reading. It's a journal basically, and explains the inner workings of the school and a lot of the things that happened during those years. The report would mention the status and well-being of the students every time he had a discussion or a report to the headquarters, and he would mention, whether the students were doing well or if they were sick or if they had deaths occur. Reverend Johnson actually lost 2 of his children. He was away to an annual meeting in Missouri. When he came home, 2 of his children had died from sickness. So he wasn't immune to problems with that. In 1852, there was a terrible cholera epidemic that decimated the Shawnee tribe. There were many of the adults that died, but oddly enough, there were no student deaths. In his report, he mentions that there were no student deaths that year. This is the front page of the Annals of the Shawnee Methodist Mission, which was compiled by the State Historical Society, and you could get a copy of it online from there. It's got a lot of great information. It has a lot of information from Thomas Johnson, lots of comments. There were journals. There was a tremendous amount of information. Not all good, of course, but it's a really great resource to look if you want to look at this stuff for yourself. So as I mentioned earlier, with Thomas Johnson's quarterly and annual reports to the Methodist Church, he would note in his report what had happened. And in case of the student deaths, these were excerpts from the Annals of the Methodist Mission. And so in 1840, his two children died. In 52, that's when the cholera epidemic hit the area and created a lot of orphans. My second great-grandparents both died at this time, and very likely due to cholera. And the odd thing was that Thomas Johnson wrote that there wasn't a single death that occurred out of the 106 scholars and the laborers that worked there during that time of the cholera epidemic. And then 53, 55. So these were actually the only years. I think grand total there were about 16 deaths or so from the time he was keeping records until the end. And I don't have any reason to believe that they buried hundreds of children on the grounds, as been stated by some of the people trying to get the mission turned over to the tribe. And he had no reason to lie about this stuff. I just don't believe at all that he did. And there were some students that did die, and his children as well. So the Shawnee Mission basically closed down during the Civil War. It had fewer students towards the end of its being open. A lot of it was caused by all the unrest, the bleeding Kansas, and all the problems that were occurring in the area due to the Civil War. And a lot of the people from the East were still eyeing Kansas as open land, that the only people there were the Indians, and we need to get rid of them, and we want the land for ourselves. So during the Civil War, there were a lot of raids on Kansas. Of course, you all know about Quantrell's raid, and Black Bob Band, which was the one that did not want to assimilate, they all packed up and left and went to western Kansas to get away from the fighting. And by the time they came back after the war, their lands were already settled by white settlers, even though it was still their land. So they ended up losing that land altogether. Some of them stayed there. A few moved to Indian Territory. But by 1870, most of the Shawnee had all relocated to Cherokee Nation in northeast Indian Territory. And at that point, the entire state was open to white settlement. Up to this point, I've talked about how the Shawnee lived in Ohio and in Kansas, and that they had basically settled down, and they were trying to assimilate the best they could into white society. Like it or not, that's what happened. And a lot of people don't like that term, and they lost a lot of their culture, but it was either that or be killed and completely eliminated, like some of the other tribes were. So we want to contrast that with the tribes that are on the Great Plains. There's a significant difference, and why, in my opinion, the reason for the government-run boarding schools and why it was different than the Shawnee Indian Mission. So after the Civil War, the westward migration of white settlers to the western part of the United States started to really ramp up. The Shawnee Indian Mission was actually on the Santa Fe Trail and the California Trail, and so there were quite a few people coming through at that point, but not like it ended up in a decade later. So Plains tribes didn't have a lot of interaction with whites up until the Santa Fe Trail time period. They had been inter, interacting with fur trappers and traders, and that didn't seem to pose much of a threat to them. But the three trails that went through the Kansas City area really allowed mass movement of people to the west. So the Plains tribes started getting a taste of what the Shawnee had 200 years earlier, and they didn't want all these people coming. And so after the Civil War, this really kind of ramped up, and they started fighting back. If you look at the Great Plains after the Civil War, or just barely during the Civil War and later, as these wagon trains started moving west and trying to settle in these areas, guess what? They were trying to displace the tribes this was their homeland. And so during this time period, there were all kinds of fighting, all kinds of massacres that happened. If you look at this one, you've got as early as 1862 in Minnesota, where the cavalry is fighting the Chippewa or the Ojibwe. And then later, there's the last one on this particular map is Wounded Knee. And most of us have heard about Wounded Knee. It was a massacre by the cavalry. And so the people that were trying to move west were being killed by the different tribes because they were encroaching on their lands and trying to settle. And it was the same thing that the Shawnee had happened to them nearly 200 years earlier. During this time, there were lots of wars that erupted in the West. Some of the tribes that were involved were the Sioux, the Kickapoo, Comanche, Cheyenne, Arapaho, Apache, Kiowa, Pawnee. These were not Northeast Algonquin tribes. They were all farming. This was what you would consider wild Indians. And so there was a Wichita Village about 1858 was a fight, a battle. And then, of course, Little Bighorn was somewhat later. And then the last one again was Wounded Knee. And so you probably a lot more familiar with these fighting, these massacres, all of this trouble that ended up well after the Shawnee had started farming. So if you remember your history, these are some of the Plains Indian chiefs that were out there: Black Kettle, Crazy Horse, Quanah Parker, Geronimo, Cochise, Red Cloud, Sitting Bull, Chief Joseph. All of these were different tribes, and they all had the same goal in mind, was to keep the settlers from moving in and taking their land. Guess what? It's the same thing that happened to the Shawnee, and it's happening again. But these people seem to be working better together, and there was just havoc that went on with these tribes versus the cavalry and the settlers trying to move in to their area. Of course, we're all familiar with the Battle of Little Bighorn, Custer's Last Stand. And when that happened, the newspapers back east, there was a public outcry. It was such a horrible affair to the white population back east, and all of the terrible newspaper articles about it, that they really convinced the government they needed to do something about the problems with the tribes in the West. So they increased the military presence and basically decided they were going to end up getting rid of the Indian tribes no matter what. Well, they eventually did get rid of the tribes, or they thought they did. They stopped them from fighting. They put them all on reservations. They took all their guns away. They were unfortunately a defeated people, and so the government, in their infinite wisdom, felt like they needed to assimilate all of these children in the tribes themselves, and the only way they could think about doing it was to gather up these children and send them to government-run boarding schools. And this was 20 years after the close of the Shawnee Indian Mission school. So keep that in mind. 20 years later, in 1879, the Carlisle Indian School was opened in Pennsylvania. That was the first school to be opened. And so this era of forced assimilation had begun. And as you all know, once the government starts a program, it rarely stops it. And so they lasted for decades. It went from 1870 something for 60, 70 years, I think. And they were bad. You can't say anything good about these boarding schools. They were not good, but it is not the same thing as the Shawnee Mission. So in my opinion, the Shawnee Manual Labor School was not anything like the government forced boarding schools of the late 1800s. And to say that they were the same, or to insinuate that they were the same, is just a lie. The students were not forced to attend the Shawnee School. Their parents, if their parents wanted them to attend because they thought that they could contribute to their community after learning schools, then the parents sent them to the school. There was one story that one boy had run away 3 times. He didn't want to go to school, like any young boy who wants to go to school. And so he'd run away 3 times. And the 3rd time, his father tied him on a horse and took him back. His father knew that that's where he needed to be. And the boy, well, you ask a 10-year-old boy what you want to do. Well, he isn't going to say he wants to go to school. And so there's the story, that story is blown out of proportion, and it's completely inaccurate from what really happened. So the Shawnees were decades removed from being wandering nomads that would kill white settlers on sight. They hadn't done that. They did it, but they hadn't done it since 1800. And so the Plains Indians were the ones doing that. They were still warlike. The Shawnee had built homes and ranches, and they lived like their white neighbors. They couldn't tell them apart. But the Plains tribes were still very warlike, and the government, all they could think of was kill the Indian and save the child. I want to say Niawe, which is thank you in Shawnee for listening to my story. I believe that it's pretty clear that the Shawnee Indian Mission was not the same as a government forced boarding school. The children went there because they wanted to learn something. Was it the best thing in the world? Well, I can't say that, but I do know that most of the Shawnee leaders were involved in overseeing the school. They would not have let things go on that has been claimed it went on, and that it was actually a good thing for the tribe. If they had to assimilate, which they had to, either that or die, it was the best course for them. Had they been in the Plains tribes, it was not a good course for them. It ended up being a terrible thing for those tribes. But that's the difference between, I believe, the Shawnee Indian Mission and the later government-run boarding schools, and all of the disinformation that we've heard for the last 2 years is just that, disinformation. Thank you again.